The gospel lesson today is from the Gospel of Mark. We're in chapter 1, verses 29 through 39. In my Bible, it's entitled, Jesus Heals Many. As soon as they left the synagogue, they went from James and John to the home of Simon and Andrew. Simon's mother-in-law was in bed with a fever, and they told Jesus about her. So he went to her, took her hand, and helped her up. The fever left her, and she began to wait on them. That evening after sunset, the people brought to Jesus all the sick and demon-possessed. The whole town gathered at the door, and Jesus healed many who had various diseases. He also drove out many demons, but he would not let the demons speak, because they knew who he was. Very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house, and went off to a solitary place where he prayed. Simon and his companions went to look for him, and when they found him, they exclaimed, "Everyone is looking for you." And Jesus replied, "Let us go somewhere else, to the nearby villages, so I can preach there also. That is why I have come." And so he traveled throughout Galilee, preaching in their synagogues and driving out demons. This is the word of our Lord.
Thanks be to God.
You may be seated. I've entitled this sermon, Sticks and Stones. And we're going to talk about the words and the difference they make in our lives. During the course of his sermon, a preacher wanted to emphasize the brevity of life. He took a long pause and then he said, "Every member of this church is going to die." But to his ultimate surprise, a man in the back row responded to his statement with a huge grin on his face. Well, the evangelist was stunned, and so he repeated the phrase with even greater volume, and this time he noticed that the man crossed his arms and looked even happier than before. Well, this rattled the preacher so much that he literally shouted the words a third time at the top of his lungs, "Every member of this church is going to die." But in the midst of a loud but serious cry of amens from the congregation, that guy in the back seat just kept beaming from ear to ear. Well, immediately after the service, the evangelist tracked the man down and asked, "Why in the world did you smile so big when I said every member of this church is going to die?" And the man erupted with a huge smile and said, "Because I'm not a member of this church." Words don't always convey the message or the meaning that we intend, do they? Sometimes we just get it wrong. You've probably heard people try to tell a joke, and somebody standing there took it seriously, didn't find it funny at all. It wasn't a joke to them when it was intended to be one. Other times someone offers encouragement, and instead of finding those words encouraging, the person who hears them might find them patronizing or condescending in some way. Sometimes we state words that are meant to energize people and to lift them up, and instead they just fall on deaf ears, not taken the way they were intended. It's a common mistake we make because we're human. Yeah. We don't always understand what a person means by listening to their words. By the way, that is compounded by technology, right? The words that we say on Facebook or in an email, I learned early on that they didn't always come across the way I intended them. In fact, I ended up hurting people that I was trying to encourage. And if that same words had been spoken in person between the two of us, the meaning probably would have come across the way I intended it. So as a result of that, somebody invented all these emoticons, the emoji things that you put on there to indicate that you were joking or laughing or smiling or something else, because there's no body language in words. Our passage today is not the gospel passage that I read today. Instead, it comes from Psalm 19. I'm going to begin with verses 13 and 14, but we'll be talking a lot about the other verses in Psalm 19 as well. So, verses 13 and 14 say, keep your servant from willful sins. And you can just plug and set a servant, me, in there, because that's the intent. Keep me from willful sins. May they not rule over me. And then I will be blameless, innocent of great transgression. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. I have on the mirror in my bedroom that particular passage right there. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. The only way our words are acceptable is if they reflect the love and obedience of God's commands. You know that? He has told us how he wants us to act. And when our words reflect those commands, then they make a difference and they are acceptable to him. So here's this passage in context. The law of the Lord is perfect, refreshing the soul. The statutes of the Lord are trustworthy, making wise the simple. The precepts of the Lord are right, giving joy to the heart. The commands of the Lord are radiant, giving light to the eyes. The fear of the Lord is pure, enduring forever. For today's, our language today, you can substitute respect maybe in there in place of fear. So our respect of the Lord is pure, enduring forever. The decrees of the Lord are firm, and all of them are righteous. They are more precious than gold, than much pure gold. They are sweeter than honey from the honeycomb. By them your servant is warned. In keeping them there is great reward. But who can discern their own errors? Forgive my hidden faults. It's just normal human behavior, and every psychologist or psychiatrist who even doesn't know Christ knows this about our behavior. We're far more likely to see somebody else's problems than we are to recognize our own. You know that? Oh yeah, I can tell every one of you exactly what's wrong with you right now. Yep, no problem. Piece of cake. But figuring out what's going on here, I don't have a clue. It's really hard to figure out what's going on with Chris. Yeah. If I wanted to know, I could ask you though, right? And you could tell me. Because we always know what's wrong with the other. Verse 13 says, who can discern their own errors? It's a serious problem. And the words that come out of our mouth, we don't even know the impact that they have. And sometimes a horrible negative impact. So there's a direct relation between the words of my mouth and the law of the Lord. That's what I'd like you to kind of catch on to today. The words of the mouth and the law of the Lord are linked. They're directly connected. This is Ephesians 4:29. Do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths, but only what is helpful for building others up according to their needs, that it may benefit those who listen. You see, it doesn't benefit if it somehow is a barrier to growth. The words that you say can actually come between another person and Christ. They can become a barrier. And in fact, those same words can become a barrier to yourself. They come between you and Christ, and they become barriers to growth. Now, it's not just enough that they become barriers to your growth, but they also can become barriers to the church's growth. Because when people hear certain words that come out of your mouth, they think, didn't that person attend the Covenant Church down there in New Sweden? And all of a sudden, they don't have much use for you or for your religion or for your God, or for your church. And I'm telling you, one little word can cause that, and it will take a lifetime to gain back that respect that you've lost. A lifetime. So we separate people from God with our words. And here's the thing. When your words are kind, when they're beautiful, when you're lifting somebody up, when you're caring for somebody with your words, suddenly people notice you. And not just you. They say to themselves, didn't that person go to that little church, that Covenant Church there in New Sweden? I might like to visit that place. They know. They know who you are. They know where you attend church. They know the faith that you have claimed for yourself. And when you're kind and loving, especially in a situation where most people wouldn't be, they're drawn not just to you, but they're drawn to your faith and they're drawn to your church. Be kind. Be encouraging. Be helpful. Even if you don't mention the name of Christ, it's a witness. You know that? It's a witness. Sometimes I think, it's just fun to mess with people. Yeah. But there's bad ways to mess with people, and there's good ways to mess with people. If somebody comes up to you and they're screaming in your face, and they're angry, and their face is red, and they're just... There's people in the world that know how to push your buttons, right? Yeah, especially the ones you live closest with, the one you're closest to. Boy, they know exactly how to push your buttons. And they don't mind doing it once in a while. Now imagine this person is just busy pushing all your buttons, expecting this big blow-up reaction from you, and instead you say, your hair looks nice today. Well, that just puts them on the defense, doesn't it? That's disarming. They don't know what to do with that. It wasn't the response they expected. It's fun to mess with people in that way, yeah. And actually, it's helpful. It's helpful as well. James 3, verses 9 and 10. With the tongue we praise our Lord and Father, and with that same tongue we curse human beings who have been made in God's likeness. Out of the same mouth comes praise and cursing. My brothers and sisters, this should not be. Can both fresh water and salt water flow from the same spring? My brothers and sisters, can a fig tree bear olives or a grapevine bear figs? Neither can a salt spring produce fresh water. I want to talk about gossip for a minute. Have you ever heard anybody say it's not gossip if it's the truth? Yeah, it's still gossip. Trust me. Gossip has nothing to do with truth, whether it's good or bad, whether it's false or true. That has nothing to do with whether it's gossip or not. Gossip, well, let me give you a little definition. Gossip is simply talking about people when they're not there to defend themselves. Yeah, it's gossip. When you talk about people who are not there to defend themselves, then it's gossip. But it doesn't really matter what you're saying about them. So the first rule of thumb when it comes to gossip is don't say anything about someone you wouldn't say in their presence. Would that change what you say? I think it would change what you say. Don't say anything about someone that you wouldn't say if they were standing in your circle, sitting at your table, there to hear it. And the second rule about gossip that I'd like you to hear is if you find that you have to lower your voice to say something, maybe it shouldn't be said at all. Yeah, that's something you just need to keep to yourself. Gossip is never helpful, and oftentimes we have no clue whether we are spreading something that's true or false. We hurt people when we gossip, and it's just not part of the Christian life, or at least it shouldn't be. So, don't say anything about someone you wouldn't say in their presence. Are you getting an idea about how powerful our words are? Proverbs 18:21. The tongue has the power of life and death, and those who love it will eat its fruit. The tongue has the power of life and death. I'm going to finish this sermon with a story. It's a story about a few words that gave life instead of death. It's called Ruby's Prayer. Ruby Hamilton, a businesswoman in her 50s, was stunned at the loss of her husband of 32 years in a car accident. Her anger and disappointment went deeper than a more typical expression of grief, though. She had become a follower of Christ in her late 20s, but her husband didn't share her newfound interest in spiritual things. Nonetheless, she had set about praying for him feverishly and unceasingly that he would come to know the Lord. And one day when she was praying, she felt a wave of peace wash over her, and that still small voice assuring her that her husband would be okay. She eagerly awaited the day when her husband surrendered his life to Jesus, and now he was gone. What do you do when faith doesn't make sense? When God doesn't seem to be answering or opening doors or being found? Ruby Hamilton stopped living for God. Roger Simmons was hitchhiking his way home. He would never forget the date, May 7th. His heavy suitcase was making him tired, and he was anxious to take off that army uniform once and for all. Flashing the thumb to the oncoming car, he lost hope when he saw it was a black, sleek, new Cadillac. But to his surprise, the car stopped. The passenger door swung open, and he ran toward the car, tossed his suitcase in the back, and thanked the handsome, well-dressed man as he slid into the front seat. Going home for keeps? Sure am. Well, you're in luck if you're going to Chicago. Not quite that far. Do you live in Chicago? I have a business there, the driver said. My name is Hamilton. They chatted for a while, and then Roger, a Christian, felt a compulsion to share his faith with this 50-ish, apparently successful businessman. But he kept putting it off until he realized that he was now just 30 minutes from his home. If he was going to do it, it was now or never. Mr. Hamilton, I would like to talk to you about something Very important. And then he simply told Mr. Hamilton about the plan of salvation and ultimately asked him if he would like to receive Jesus as his Savior and Lord. The Cadillac pulled over to the side of the road. Roger expected that he was about to get thrown out of the car. Instead, the businessman bowed his head and received Christ. And then he thanked Roger. "This is the greatest thing that has ever happened to me," he said. 5 years went by. Roger married, had a couple of kids and a business of his own. Packing his suitcase for a trip to Chicago, he found a small white business card that had been given to him by Hamilton 5 years previous. In Chicago, he looked up Hamilton Enterprises. The receptionist told him that it was impossible to see Mr. Hamilton, but he could see Mrs. Hamilton. A little confused, he was ushered into a beautiful office where he found himself facing a keen-eyed woman in her 50s. She extended her hand. "You knew my husband?" And Roger told her about how Hamilton had picked him up while he was hitchhiking home after the war. She said, "Can you tell me what day that was?" "Sure. It was May 7th, 5 years ago, the day I was discharged from the Army." "Anything special about that day?" she asked. He hesitated, not knowing if he should mention how he shared the message of Jesus with her husband. "Mrs. Hamilton, I explained the gospel to your husband that day. He pulled over to the side of the road and wept against the steering wheel, and he gave his life to Christ that day." Explosive sobs shook her body. And finally, getting a grip on herself, she sobbed, "I have prayed for my husband's salvation for years, and I believed God would save him." "Where is your husband, Ruby?" "He's dead." "He was in a car crash after he let you out of the car. He never made it home." You see, I thought God had not kept his promise. I stopped living for God 5 years ago because I thought God had not kept his word. These are the words of David. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. God bless.